everyone, I'm Rebecca and welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing on with the 1830s dress project, which I am already so thrilled about and I feel like it's going really well. I'm getting a bit of a late start this week as it is already Wednesday, but what I've done so far is I did a little bit of the hand sewing that I needed to do, which, by the way, if you haven't seen the first two videos in this series, I will link the playlist up above and down below so you can go check those two videos out. But what I've done so far is I've put the stitching on this side of the neckline, so that is all stitched down with the piping now. And what I'm doing currently is I'm putting the facings on the center front of this bodice. So I have already done one side mostly. I have it pinned in place on the inside, but it looks all nice on the outside. And then I realized, I should probably film this and let you know how I'm doing this facing. So what I've done is I cut a 2-inch wide strip right here. You can see this one where it's just sewn on one side so far. And this is the 2-inch wide strip. I didn't even finish the edges or anything, but I cut it so that it would follow this front edge of the bodice and then be 2 inches from wherever that is. So it curves on both sides. And then I've sewn this down by machine right here along the edge, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then I've folded that over, turned it over to the inside. Now, one thing that I did is that I went to the end here as in the serged edge here. So I went all the way to the end and matched that up down here at the hem. But up here, I had already done the piping on the inside of the neckline. And so I've actually taken this and gone 1/2 inch past where that piping is. And I'm only sewing until it hits the edge of the piping. So that way, when I fold it in, I can fold in the top right here so that it's all nice clean edges, and then from the front you just see the piping. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to put the other side also down, and then the inside gets stitched down by hand over here. So that'll be the next step. Once that's done, I can go ahead and add the sleeves in. The sleeves are complete except for the piping hem being stitched down by hand. Other than that, they are complete. So I'll probably do that hand stitching and then set the sleeves in. I set them by machine because, in my opinion, that's way easier. I know a lot of people seem to disagree, but like, yeah, machine sewing is basically always easier than hand sewing in my opinion. So I'm gonna set those sleeves in, and then at that point we're ready to start attaching this to the skirt. Now I kind of wish that there was a way for me to do that bias trim up the front on the bodice before I connect it to the skirt, but right now it's literally one strip that's already on the skirt and it's connected, and I'm hoping that I can just continue that strip up so that it literally doesn't even have a gap at the waist. We'll see if that's actually able to happen, but that is my goal. So that means that once these are connected together, then I will be able to hand sew that strip on to the center front. And that's hand sewn because otherwise the stitches would be obvious. So that's my theory on hand sewing, is that like, if the stitches are going to be big, ugly, and obvious by machine, like a hem or like trim, then you have to do it by hand. But if it's not going to be obvious, then just do it by machine because it's a lot faster and easier. Okay, anyway, I am going to get to working on these facings. So first off, I need you all to see that Lion is wearing an alligator costume right now because he has been scratching his tummy and a lot, and even putting socks on didn't prevent him from scratching his tummy. And this happens to have a band around his tummy at the exact place that he's been scratching. So Lion is now wearing an alligator costume with socks on, and I'm probably gonna call the vet tomorrow if he doesn't stop scratching, because I don't know what's going on with him, but he's been doing it for 3 days and I'm scared for him because he made himself bleed and that makes me sad. Okay, so that was the first completely unrelated costume thing, but I thought that you would all want to see Lion as an alligator. I'm going to insert a picture right here of him being particularly derpy in his alligator costume because he's so cute. And now back to sewing. In sewing news, I have sleeves. They're actually like on the bodice and everything. You can see that nice piping going on there. I especially love it in the back where you get like the piping meeting the piping. I mean, I have it on the shoulder too, but like I just love when piping meets piping. It's just like a match made in heaven. Anyway, so those are all done, and I did do the sewing down of the piping on the inside of the wrist, and I also sewed the facings down by hand. So that is all done. Basically, the bodice portion here is now all complete except for closures that trim up the center front and actually attaching it to the skirt, and bows, because that'll probably be the last thing that I do, is to finish making all of those bows. I've made 2, I think I need 10, and I will show you how to do those later on in this video. So now I can go ahead and attach this to the skirt. So suddenly this project is going to become huge because the skirt is so unwieldy with the organdy in there. So to attach it to the skirt, I'm actually just going to do right sides together, matching up the front edges, and basically just taking all of the pleat section of the skirts, matching it, and at some point it's going to turn into cartridge pleats. At that point I stopped because cartridge pleats have to be sewn on by hand for them to hang like cartridge pleats. So all of the knife pleats, that can all be sewn on by machine, and then I'll just have that small section of like 8 inches or so in the back to do by hand, so it's way easier. So I'm gonna go ahead, pin that in place and sew it. Again, I'm just like I showed in the last video, because of the piping, I'm just gonna be sewing it on the stitches that are already there, making sure that the bodice side is up because that'll show me where to stitch. Did the same thing for the sleeves, and I will show you what it looks like once I get the knife pleats all stitched down and it's just the cartridge pleats, and then I'll show you how to stitch those cartridge pleats down. So scratch that, because I realized as I pinned half of this in place that I didn't actually have an exact point at which the overlap happens on the bodice, so therefore I don't know where it can meet up with the skirt. So what I've done so far instead is I have basted one side in place. This is the side that is the outer part of the overlap, and so I know that this part is going to wind up being center front, just like the center front of the skirt underneath the decorative flap. This side, on the other hand, I don't know how far it's going to overlap underneath. It might be 1/4 of an inch. I really hope it's more than that. It might be 1/2 an inch. I don't know. So that I'm gonna have to try on. And since it is 10:30 and I have to work tomorrow, it's not happening right now. So I guess that'll happen tomorrow afternoon, and I will put on my corset and try on the dress and bodice, see how that's going, see where the overlap is, mark everything, pin everything, and then sew all the pleats in place. So for now, good night. Okay, so first off, eating a giant burrito for dinner when I knew full well that I was going to have to put on a corset to try on my whole dress situation, not a good idea, even with a Regency or 1830s style corset that really doesn't compress you. Yeah, not a good idea. The Mexican food, delicious, especially the churro, but I am now regretting this. Secondly, there are a few things that I'm hoping to accomplish while wearing all of this since I'm already put it on. One is obviously mark where that center front closure overlaps. 2 is to attach the bodice to the skirt once I have that marking done. And 3, I have decided that instead of starching my petticoats first, I am going to mark the hem with them unstarched. And this is the reason why. I know me. I know that every time that I go to wear this dress, I will not necessarily starch my petticoats first. In fact, the likelihood that I will starch my petticoats every time that I go to wear this dress is close to 0. So, that said, I feel like it is better to have a kind of long side length of this dress, as in what would it look like if I'm wearing petticoats that are completely unstarched and it will skim the top of my foot, no ankle showing, etc. And then if I do starch my petticoats, which I should, if I do starch them before I wear them, then I've just got that slightly earlier 1830s length as opposed to like the mid 1830s where it starts to get a little bit longer, which is where I'm at with this. So it's really not that far off. It's just that my hem is a little 1833 instead of 1836. No big deal. So let's go ahead and try all of that on. So I'm really happy with how things are looking right now. I kind of pinned this center bit in place here, but the bodice overlap is very good. Just take that down. So this is the bodice overlap currently. It does kind of a wonky thing here where it curves, but I mean, it was always going to do that. But otherwise, like, even the plaids are doing really, really well. And I think that there is enough overlap to feel fine about the hooks and eyes. It feels like, I mean, it's definitely not regular, but it feels like it's probably about 3/4 of an inch for the most part overlap, maybe even an inch. So that is excellent. And I can put those hooks and bars on there just fine. And then this will go over the top. The funny thing is, I almost actually do not like how it is unbroken right here over the waist. Like, I should have put this under the piping and then done another strip probably. Also, like, just have the piping go on top of it. But at the same time, it really doesn't matter because the sash is going to go across there. So yeah, it really doesn't matter if it's unbroken or not because you're not going to see that waist bit. But everything else feels really great. I haven't looked at the hem. It's kind of hard to look at the hem because everything is so big and poofy. It feels like it really doesn't need to be shortened much at all, but I will get that stop when, you know, this is actually attached and not hanging off of the waist right now. But I have everything marked here so that now I know where it needs to go. So I am going to go ahead and just make sure I have all of my edges marked here so I know the overlap, and then have everything marked there. And then I can sew on the machine until I get to the cartridge pleating, just like I did on this side with the basting, and sew all of that in place, just leaving the cartridge pleating. And there's a small enough area of cartridge pleating that I feel fine just pinning that in place to do the hem. In order to do the hem, I think that'll be just fine. And that way, once that's attached while I'm wearing everything, before I actually like do hand sewing, which will take a while, then I can mark all of the hem and then do like mega hand sewing. The hem, the trim, the hooks and eyes, the cartridge pleating, and that's it, really. I mean, besides that, I think it's just the bows. That's all I've left. So ideally, it's Thursday night right now at about 10:30. Ideally, I would want to finish this by Sunday. We shall see if that happens. But stating it right now, that is my goal. So I am going to get to sewing and I will check in with you in a little bit. Alrighty, so skirts are now fully attached to the bodice except for that little cartridge pleating section in the back, which the cartridge pleating section, I guess I will show you when I'm, you know, it's not in back of me. It is just like this big. It's the center back section of the bodice, that's it. So now it is time to look at the hem. Please ignore all of the fabric that I haven't put away that I've purchased, like all of those bolts of wool from fabric.com and the Fancy Styles fabric, a couple of yards there that I've won. That's most of what's in this pile. It's just a lot of wool, mostly. Anyway, I told you to ignore it and then I showed it to you. So we're looking at the hem right now. At least Elsa's not in front of the mirror anymore, right? For those of you who have been around my channel long enough to know about Elsa, thank you, because that was almost a year ago at this point. Okay, so as you can see, it's actually off the floor already. I haven't even like folded it up or anything, so this might actually be super, super easy hem. I might just take a narrow hem and call it good. I think the very center front might need a skosh more than that. Also, as you can see, I don't feel like I need to starch my petticoats at all because this organdy is so stiff and papery that it really just stands out on its own. Like, what is going on right here on the side of the skirt? It is literally just like ridging out on its own. Yeah, things are weird. But yeah, I think for the most part, other than the very center front there, I can just turn a narrow hem and be done with it. The very center front, I'll probably turn up, I don't know, 3/4 inch hem or something like that. Very small, but it should be very, very easy. I'm gonna go ahead and pin and press that right now, and we will see how that goes. I'll give it a try as it's pinned. And we are now hemmed. Okay, we're not hemmed, we're pinned in place. Our hem is pinned. I really like this length. I think it's going to be a good length. Yes, I did this whole thing without actual shoes on, but shoes of this era are flat, so it doesn't matter. So my hem is all nice and even. I couldn't just follow the plaid, unfortunately, because, you know, you always need more length in the back than you do in the front. It's not a big difference, but I think I have about like one motif of plaid difference basically in the back versus the front. So that's fine, but at least it is even. And now I can go ahead and do all of that hand sewing. So I'm going to get out of my corset and all of that sort of stuff, and basically I should be able to hand sew everything else that needs to have happened at this point until I get to bows. So that's going to be the next time that I really have anything for you, I think, because I am going to hand sew my hem and the closures up the front and the cartridge pleats. And I feel like when I had this list for you before, there was something else. Oh, and the trim right here. That'll be the last thing. So yeah, all of that has to happen, and then I will come back and show you how to make my bows. I realized that although I showed you how to actually do cartridge pleats, I didn't show you how to attach the cartridge pleats. So let's take a look at how to attach these cartridge pleats. Hopefully this overhead visual will work. It's kind of a weird angle, I do apologize. But basically first I have these kind of pinned in place with just a few pins, but I want to make sure that the pleats are all kind of evenly distributed, and if anything that they are more pleated in the back than they are over here. Now I don't have enough pleats or yardage here to have it like completely squished in together. So this just kind of has to do, you just kind of have to distribute them where you need to. And then you're going to kind of do two passes of stitching. So first you're going to stitch the edges together, and you do that by every time you have a valley, as in like the part that goes against the fabric from the bodice, you want to take at least one, if not two stitches there. So you just kind of start it on the side. I'm using one thread doubled, and these can really be any size stitches because we're going to go ahead and do another pass over the top of this. But you want to take a stitch there, then go to the next one. I'm probably going about 1/4 inch down from the top to take these stitches. You don't want to make them too big because then it'll just kind of crunch up, but you want all of this to be secure. And you are going to do this in every single cartridge pleat. I think this is what gives cartridge pleating such a bad name. It's not the pleating itself, it's the stitching of every single pleat, because gosh, this takes quite some time. But all you're doing is passing from one valley to the next and taking one stitch in that valley, then passing to the next valley and taking a stitch in that valley, and so on and so forth for every cartridge pleat. Now for skirts that are just cartridge pleated to the bodice, this is where it kind of ends. Normally actually you would have finished the bottom of the bodice and you would be attaching it actually kind of even from the outside, but basically they're practically just meeting with like the tiniest bit of overlap. But basically your skirt top needs to be finished and your bodice needs to be finished, and then the two finished spots meet. However, this is only cartridge pleated in the very back, so there will be another pass of sewing after this so that the seam allowance remains the same between the cartridge pleats and the rest of the skirt. So once you have stitched in all of your valleys, you can finally go ahead and tie off your needles that you used from the cartridge pleating. So now unfortunately I have made mine a little bit inaccessible because they are stuck underneath the stitching that went over the pocket here. So I'm just going to tie them all off within this seam allowance area up here. Shouldn't really be a big deal, but you do want a knot on the end before you cut that needle off. Once those are tied off, now we can go ahead and look at it from the other side because we do still have one more line of stitching to do. So right now what is happening here is basically it's attached way up there at the top, but it's not attached to the piping. So we need our piping to stay right along there. So that means that what we need to do is we need to do some stitching right here in the ditch of the piping so that it stays just like everything else. So you can really do pretty much like any type of stitch that you want here. I'm just going to do probably a kind of a running stitch, maybe a running back stitch, just so it's a little bit more secure, but they're going to be pretty big stitches. You just want to make sure that they are catching through at least a few of those cartridge pleats at a time. You can go through, I'd say 3 or 4 at a time and be just fine. And yes, I am well aware that I should be wearing a thimble for this, but I hate thimbles. And now that it's done, this piping can't go anywhere. It's nicely tacked down, so it looks like the rest of the skirt over the pleats and everything like that. And now for good measure, a cat. So pretty. I have been doing a whole bunch of hand sewing on this little lady here. Her hem is completely finished, all hand stitched, and I've done up all of the hooks and bars except I believe the top hook, all up and down the front. And I put hooks and bars below the waist too, 3 of them every 2 inches, so that that front placket where the skirt part closes would stay closed nicely. I think that is all of the hand sewing that I've done since I last talked to you. The one thing that I paused before doing and have not done yet is the strip of trim up the center front, the bias trim that continues up from the center front of the skirt, because I kind of looked at it, went to pin it in place, and it just wasn't looking right. A, I wasn't sure if it was actually centered, and B, I just wasn't sure I liked it. So what I have decided at this point is I'm going to make my bows, and that way I will have all of my like potential trimmings done, and I can see how it all goes together and see if I even want that bias trim up the center front at all. So let's get into bow making. Now I wish that I could say that bows were a great scrap busting method, because I do have all of these scraps, little, well, medium to large pieces that have been left off from all of the various other cuts that I've done of this fabric, but unfortunately they're not. Bows actually take up a lot more fabric than you would anticipate. These bows, for example, which are not actually very large, this is 7 by 12 inches of fabric right here. And if you're going to do centers that actually are out of the bow fabric, or you're going to do larger bows, or you're going to do bows with tails or whatever, it's just going to get bigger. So I am going to have to cut actual yardage of this fabric for these bows. That said, luckily I do have a lot of fabric of this silk, so it's totally fine. I believe that I started with 9 yards of this fabric, and I'm kind of surprised how little that I have left considering it was 9 yards. I definitely didn't think that I would take that much, but because I did all of my ruffles on the bias, that eats up so much fabric, and that's what really caused a lot of those scraps left, because they're especially small triangular scraps, so a lot of that was from the ruffles and the piping and everything being on the bias, and then just leaving myself with the small triangles where I didn't need any more ruffles or bias. So I haven't actually measured how much yardage I have left, but it is not a lot. I mean, like, this is maybe a little over a yard, I would say, of like the actual selvage edge on both sides, and then I do have more that is left on the bias. So do keep that in mind if you go to do a dress like this. I would say in general, if you're doing a 30s dress, like a typical early 30s big sleeve type dress, you are going to want to use as much yardage for your skirt. It's going to be 3 panels of whatever your skirt length is. So I think for me it's like 42 inches or something like that for this era, because it's not very long. So basically that is, just doing total random math in my head, that's going to be like 4 yards right there. And then you really want a yard per sleeve with those large sleeve dresses, so that's 6 yards, and another yard for bodice and another yard for piping. So 8 yards actually is what goes into this, so I guess it's not surprising that that's what I have left. but yeah, it does eat up a lot of fabric. If you're shorter, you obviously get away with less. Probably also if you are smaller, like smaller around the waist, you don't necessarily need 3 panels around, I guess. So you could use less yardage that way too if you are smaller. But for someone of my size, my stature, I guess really, because of all that silly piping and everything, you're looking at about 8 yards. It doesn't look it, but it is. So anyway, let's cut our 7 by 12 inch rectangles out of this. I think I'm going to need 10 bows. Honestly, I might need 11, but I'm going to start with 10. I have already made 2, so I need to cut 8 of these out. Okay, I've cut out all of my pieces and now we are going to start to actually assemble them. So one thing is that I did cut these out following the grain, but this fabric is not currently on grain. So you want to fold this hot dog style like this so that your plaid matches. But if you notice, my plaid is not edging right, is not meeting up right. So what that means is I'm going to have to pull this onto the grain. So basically I am going to start here and then just like pull with the iron until this actually makes a square on the grain instead of whatever shape this is that is definitely not rectangular. So I'm going to attempt to press this in place and make it match. So to do that, I'm going to start at one corner and just pin that so that I know where it has to like get to. And then I am just going to start steaming. I'm going to pin the other corner even though it's not flat. And then I just want to pull it to get to the right shape. Pulling it on the bias. You don't want to actually press the crease here in. You don't want that. You don't want a pressed crease. But we are there now. So now it's time to sew along this side on the machine. And I'm going to do this kind of assembly line style, so I'm actually going to pin all of these in place, make sure that they're all on the grain, and then sew this seam on all of them. And then we'll turn that right side out. And I'll show you what that looks like at that point. So once you have sewn that long seam along the edge, you want to turn this right side out, which by the way, if you do have a fabric that is one-sided, do make sure you sew your right sides together. But if your fabric is not one-sided, like mine is not, then, you know, you can just fold it whichever way. But what you are wanting to do is get this seam that you've just done, and you want to be able to isolate it so that you can press the seam without pressing your edges. So that's why I'm doing this on a sleeve board right here. But my goal here is to just press this seam without pressing up here or down here. So I have this on the very edge of my sleeve board, curving one edge off the sleeve board, and I am just pressing here. And that's pressed, and now those edges are not pressed, and we'll come back to that later. By the way, if you do not already own a sleeve board, I do highly, highly recommend getting one. They're pretty inexpensive. This one is actually a collapsible sleeve board, so it doesn't even take up much room, and you can find them on Amazon. I will leave a link down below in the description if you are looking for one. It doesn't matter, by the way, if your seam is being pressed open or to one side. You just want to press the seam itself so that it looks nice and doesn't poof out the way an unpressed seam does. So I do always try to make sure that it's all going the same direction, whether that's open, which is going to be more of a challenge, or you're making sure that your seam allowance is just going that way or this way. Just make sure it's all the same direction. Once you have pressed all of your seam allowances, I am going to go ahead and run these edges through the serger. If you don't have a serger, you could zigzag over the edges. Honestly, you really don't need to finish them at all, but I do find that it is easier with a fray-prone fabric like this to just finish those edges off. However, you're really not going to see them because they're going to wind up in the center of the bow underneath the little loop anyway. I just prefer to serge them. If you are going to serge or finish them, do make sure that you, as much as you can, that your seam is in the center just because you want it out of the way. Once you've serged your edges, you're going to take the side that has the seam on it and fold that and meet up your edges this way. This is kind of a personal preference thing. You don't have to have them on the inside, but basically I don't care if this seam is turned to the inside of the bow because it is fully going under the center of the bow. So actually my seam allowances are on the outside here underneath the bow loop. If you look closely, you can see them. But once this has the center on here and it's sewn to the dress, you are never gonna see them at all. And I feel like putting them on the back side actually gives me slightly more control than if they were on the inside. Once you have sewn that end seam here, you want to press this one open. So slide that on your sleeve board. Try not to press the edges when you do that. So you want to really just get in there with the tip of your iron and press just the seam. Then you want to get in there with your ribbon centers. I have cut these centers to be 3.5 inches long, and I believe this is 7/8 inch wide ribbon. And this is just, you know, cheap ribbon from Joann's. And you can do this two ways. One, you can just wrap this around the center and pin it in place and stitch it on the back by hand. That's one option. The other option is to take your ribbon, turn it right sides together and seam it with about like a 1/4 inch seam allowance right across here. And by the way, most of this was done with like about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. But once you seam it here, you will wind up with a little loop like this. And you can actually just shove your bow through the loop. And then just kind of floof your bow out like so, ideally making sure that your seams are all in the back and that your center is centered on your bow. And that's it. And then you just stitch this to your dress. But that's your bow, that's the front, and that is the back of the bow. So as you can tell, we really don't even see that seam allowance at all from the serging. I have finished my bows, and actually I made one less than I said I was going to. I made 9, and I think it might actually still be too many. I have pinned all of these in place right now. The way that I've pinned them is that there's 7 inches between this one and 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 this one, but then there's 7.25 inches and then there's 7.5 inches. And yet from the perspective, I swear these ones at the bottom with more space between them actually look closer together. But I wanted there to not be that much room at the bottom of the hem. And when I did 7 inches on all of them, this was like 10.5 inches to the hem, which will not be touching the ground, but I think Antoinette is sinking. So I didn't want it to be that big. And so now I think it's more like 9.5 inches or something like that. And the rest of the bows are up there. So I'm going to go take line on a walk, and then I'm going to try all of this on so that I can tell how I want this trim to be up the front or not be up the front, and where I want the bows on the bodice to go. Cause like, I don't want it to be like bust apex bow, you know, that sort of thing. And I'm a little bit concerned that I might not be able to tell entirely where I want them to go because I haven't made the pelerine collar yet. That will be part of next week's video, just FYI. So next week I'll be making the pelerine, and I will also be making a pink bonnet, and then this project will be done. So there won't be a final reveal this week, even though the dress will be done. The whole project won't be done until next week. But yep, I will be back later to figure out this whole issue. Okay, so this is part of the dilemma that I'm having. If you notice, this is like moving off to the side this way, and basically if this had continued, there would be almost no none of this sticking out this way as opposed to it being like centered, which was kind of how it started lower down. So I think that honestly I need to unattach this section of the bias strip right here and move it over just a little bit because it lost the centering, and I'm not really sure. I think I was trying to line it up with these green stripes right here, and by doing that it's not even lining up with that, because once you put the hooks and eyes in and everything, it's like there's way less green showing over here than there is over here. It's fully off of the green, and over here it's covering up like more than half of the green. So yeah, this whole thing just needs to shift farther out this way, and that way I think that if I center this up here on the edge of the bodice, that is the right answer here. And the reason that I didn't already put the hook on here is because I realized, like, well, this has to go somewhere. I'm not really sure where it's going to go, but it has to go somewhere, and probably it's going to lap over the piping. I wish that I had put it under the piping, but I don't really feel like undoing all of that. So this bit won't be too bad to undo and just shove over, and then I can continue the hand sewing up here. And I do like the spacing of the bows. I think it works really well. I have to figure out where the bows are going to go on the bodice while I'm wearing it now, but that's what's got to happen for this, because I really do like the way that the bias strip looks on here. I think that it breaks it up nicely, and even once I have some bows on it, I don't think it's going to really change how it's breaking it up or anything like that, because I still like it how it looks in between. So that's where I am at. I have to figure out bows, undo that, shove that over, hand sew that all on, and then hand sew all of the bows on, which that's just like a tacking thing. But that's gonna be it for this. Okay, so I have this strip pinned in place now. I think it's really just right. It's basically centered over the pattern repeat. So even though the plaid where it repeats changes shape, this stays the center. So I think that is the right answer. And then I have also realized that I think I'm going to need to make the pelerine first before I can determine bow placement on the bodice, even to some degree this one right here. So technically when I was laying this out, this should be just a skosh higher, like about a quarter or so inch higher. But I realized that that would get in the way of the sash. And so when I first kind of mocked everything up on the dress form, I had put this centered on the sash, but then I centered it on the piping, which is below the sash. And so now I'm not really sure where it needs to go, but I'm thinking that I still want it below the sash because I don't want it on the sash. Like, I don't think I want it to be a permanent part of that. So yeah, I'm thinking below the sash, which really won't change that distance between these two bows that much. It's again like a quarter of an inch or so. But then with the pelerine, I just don't know how far it's going to come down. And I'm kind of thinking that one of these, in my inspiration, one of these basically is on the pelerine. And so I think it might need to be on the pelerine and then probably like here-ish, but basically I would want to split the difference between the on the pelerine bow and the waist bow and put this one there. So I did make an extra bow. Maybe I will stick it on my bonnet, but yeah, I'm not really sure where those need to go. So that's going to happen next week after I have made the pelerine. So since everything else that I'm going to be doing this week is just hand sewing and you're seeing it pinned into place right now, I'm actually just going to go ahead and close out this week's vlog right now because it's not gonna look any different and I don't want to put my corset back on later to show you what it looks like. So the dress is basically done. Again, it's just sewing the bows on the skirt and sewing the bias strip up from about like hip height up. It needs to be sewn down. And that's it. I'm going to go ahead and just take care of all of that tonight. So by the time I start next week's vlog, that will all be done and it will just be the pelerine and the over-the-top pink bonnet for next week's video. So do be sure to check back next week and you will see both of those. And I might also show you the placement of the bows, or I might just show you the finished dress with all of the accessories and everything gallivanting with flowers, because that's just how I feel this dress is to me. It's such a breath of springtime. So that's my goal. Hopefully by next weekend I will be gallivanting with flowers in a fully done ensemble. So anyway, if you liked this week's video, please go ahead and click the thumbs up icon. And if you'd like to see more videos like this from me, please go ahead and click subscribe and the little bell icon to be notified every time I post a new video. I do post videos here on YouTube twice a week with my sewing vlogs like this on Tuesdays and other costuming content out on Saturdays, but I post every day over on my Instagram, so please go follow me on Instagram. That's at Lady Rebecca Fashions. And if you'd like to support all of the work that I do on this channel, I do have a link to both my Patreon and my Ko-fi accounts down below. And I'd also like to give a special shout out to my two Edwardian patrons, Heidi and Miyakyu. Thank you all so much for joining me this week. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Happy sewing!